All right. Good morning. This is Dennis Misegoy, the Libertarian candidate for U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. Thank you for joining me and watching. It is, what is it, October 13th, and we are within 1 month of the general election. So we're starting to come down to it. Before I guess getting into anything else, I want to say thank you to some of the folks helped out with the last bunch of events, but the great events that we had, first in Miami a little over a week ago, I guess almost 2 weeks ago, Tampa with Young Americans for Liberty last week, also participating in the candidate forum down in the Keys, remotely, but still, last Thursday, and back in Jacksonville this past Saturday. So thank you to everybody who came out to those, and as well as those who the local affiliates and other organizations that help kind of put that stuff together. I got to put some other things on the calendar. I know we're looking at being there at least for Saturday at CannaFest in Mount Dora. That's actually the weekend right before the election, over on November 5th. I'm looking at being out there. I need to post some of the details for that. We're going to see whatever else other things we try and get out to. We got a few interviews and little things coming up, but we are, we're getting down to it. I need to post also out here on social media. I know the team wants to get a couple events out there, but just wanted to acknowledge all that, as well as all the folks who contributed with the Little Money Bomb fundraising effort last week as well. So thank you all to everybody who participated in all of that. So I'll get started. And actually didn't quite have as a clear necessarily theme to kind of go off with this. I was hoping we'll get a little more interaction, a little more questions and stuff. I've had varying sort of things. One thing I've noticed, which is nice to see, I think, as people have been receiving mail-in ballots or checking out sample ballots ahead of going to the polls, coming up with early voting and obviously then the general election itself. There does seem to be a bit of traffic and people kind of looking at a bit of interest here and there. So that's certainly encouraging to see, and we want to make sure that people have the information they need to be able to decide. And if you haven't already, certainly obviously check out stuff with the platform. I've had a few people come and ask me for different things, either or just give me pushback on some of it. I think I know, at least with some folks with immigration, and the thing I try to stress with folks, which I'm sure coming from more the right-leaning perspective, who get hung up on this, or when you talk about having a real open and more individualist and an immigration system that respects people's rights, is most importantly is that the system we have today is broken, and from every metric and every way you look at it, it's an absolute mess. And the thing is, if people, even if your goal is ostensibly to this idea of we want to control the border or get a handle on what's happening and this and that, the only way we do that is by really getting rid of the policies that we have underlying how we deal with this. Because right now, what we've created is a situation where, for the overwhelming majority of people, there is no legal path, and even where there is a legal path, it's a expensive and long path. And when I say long, I mean in terms of years, obviously. So the end result is that the path of least resistance for the overwhelming majority of people is to just circumvent the system. And if we create that situation, well, then that's what most people are going to do. Even the people who are coming here just to get a job as like I said, as a day laborer, construction worker, a maid, or whatever. All these sort of stereotypical things we can think of. Someone who's going to pick fruits. But the question is, why are we focusing on arresting those guys and deporting those guys and trying to get them out? If our concern is for things like human traffickers and gang members and violent criminals, let's put our focus on those things by making sure that we're not clogging up the system, or not clogging up the system, but wasting our enforcement efforts on nonviolent people who are just coming here to try to do honest work, make an honest living, just like the rest of us. So, again, it boils down to that. The only way we can ever do what these people want in terms of getting control and actually getting some kind of handle on it is to change the dynamics. We can't keep having the same policy, because if the policy stays the same, it doesn't matter how much money you spend on on enforcement, building walls, and whatever else. None of it's going to work because you've created. Because none of it will overwhelm the fact that there's just no legal way. As long as there's no legal way, they're not going to be able to come in. So it's that simple. And you might say, well, other countries are able to do it and don't have this problem. People don't want to come to other countries the way they want to come here. And that's a good thing for us. We should want to be the place that people want to come to, and embrace that, and not want to get away from that and be like somebody else where people don't want to go there. So, just a little bit on that. One thing to shout out again, because I at least was able to post the graphic on a few of the social medias. I'm trying to think if I got it actually here on Facebook. But the endorsement, I know I'd posted about it a while back because they had listed me in their primary guide, even though I didn't face a primary challenge. But endorsement from Stand for Health Freedom. Thank you to those guys, standing up to the mandates, lockdowns, and everything else that went on around, particularly around COVID. There needs to be a recognition among all of us, even though that has somewhat, I guess, is no longer quite in the forefront the way that it was a couple years ago. But there needs to be a recognition, and part of what I get at is the real core difference between libertarians like myself and the Republicans and Democrats who kind of share this view of an omnipotent government that has the power to basically decide almost anything, and it's just a question between those guys about what they should do. Okay, should they shut everybody down or should they not? Should they force them to take the vaccine or not? And there's really never a confrontation with the idea of not whether or not you should, but do you have the legitimate power to? And from the libertarian perspective, this is a very easy question to answer with a big no. We take what I would think is a very core American value, the idea that the authority, any legitimate power and authority that government has to come. It doesn't come from heaven. It's not, the mandate of heaven like ancient times with all these kings and stuff. No. It is based on, it comes from the people who are governed. Okay, I think that's a core American principle. And if it comes from the people who are governed, well then the people who are governed can only vest in government that power which they actually have. So I have the right to defend myself. If someone's trying to attack me, I have a right to protect my property because it's my property. But I don't have a right to decide for somebody else what they're going to put in their body or what they won't. I don't get the right to decide for somebody else, how they're going to live or what they do with their property, all these sort of things. So once you start to really drill down and sort of follow those principles as they go down, you start to understand that government doesn't have legitimate authority to do this kind of stuff. And that's why all this sort of thing was always illegitimate. And so I'm thankful for those guys to recognize me and having me on their voter guide as an endorsed candidate. I hope we'll see a few more endorsements roll in. LP Mises Caucus, I don't think they've put out an official announcement yet, but I've been in communication. They did share some of my stuff within the last week. So I'm looking forward. Hopefully we'll have a few more endorsements to come in, a few more official from a few more official bodies here in the state and on different issues. But we'll see. People are always, and I'm thankful for them for being willing to support a third-party candidate in this race. So, again, big thanks to them, and big thanks to everybody who's been giving us a platform throughout this race. Let's see. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, the probably, again, still the issue that has the biggest potential for the biggest harm, or say the potential for the biggest harm, let me phrase it that way, which is obviously the conflict in Ukraine, with Russia's invasion there and the annexation of territory recently. Again, a real missed opportunity to kind of, again, barter some kind of different solution when they were going through with these referendums. I think the farther and farther we get away from that, the less chance we have of any kind of peaceful resolution around that. And certainly if you thought that the people there would prefer to be under the Ukrainian government, certainly I think we've reduced the chances of that territory being returned. I don't see quite how all that's going to happen. And again, particularly without escalating tensions. And again, it is interesting because, again, I've seen comments coming out from the folks on the other side about the willingness to try to negotiate. Now, obviously, there's a certain amount of cynicism there, and it's understandable from people, viewing it from the outside, and certainly from the Ukrainian perspective, say, well, what do you need to negotiate? You invaded this country. Why don't you just leave? But that belies that's a failure to recognize what motivated it. Even if it wasn't justified, what is the thing that motivated it? Because if you're convinced that it was motivated by, just territorial expansion, ambitions at expanding territory, well, then why would they be even talking about that? It doesn't make sense. But I'm not of the opinion that that's accurate, and certainly I don't think that the history backs that up. But regardless, the point is wouldn't you take every effort to de-escalate? Wouldn't you take every effort to try to stop the fighting? Wouldn't you take every opportunity to try to de-escalate and avoid the potential for nuclear weapons to come into play? It's sort of an incongruous narrative to say that that Vladimir Putin and Russia generally is being run by irrational madmen, hell-bent on territorial expansion, who will stop at nothing and need to be just stopped, but yet they would never use nuclear weapons, or the nuclear threat is just a bluff. It all flies in the face of any reason or consistent thought. If we were to actually go in, or not necessarily to say the U.S. getting involved, not only to say that in terms of who's involved, but if we make them desperate enough, what's the possibility? Got a comment here from Joe Rossi. Why don't we worry about our own country, though? Is America the world's police? This is at the core of the problem, and certainly one of the things that I try to beat the drum on as much as I can. I am the non-intervention candidate. We should not be the world's police. We don't have the authority to be the world's police. The world does not belong to the U.S. It is not ours to dictate and decide, but the people who have been in charge in our government, Republicans and Democrats, have been fixated on pursuing this unipolar and preserving this unipolar world order with the U.S. as the singular superpower, and essentially, functioning very much like an empire. 700 plus military bases around the world, all over the place, and what's the end goal? Is to be able to have veto power over what everybody else does in the world. Again, why are we so involved? And that's a lot broader than even just this issue in particular with Ukraine and Russia. But yeah, the issue is, why are we so involved? Why are we meddling? It goes, like I say, even beyond being the world police. Everything that we've done and been involved in Ukraine, if you look back to everything that went on in 2014, and you've got, John McCain and Lindsey Graham walking around with some very interesting characters in Ukraine. You're talking about the Svoboda guys and the Right Sector and C14, I think. All these sort of interesting groups that have been around and that were very vital. These extreme far right groups that were a big part of everything that went on back in 2014, that overthrew Yanukovych and really got us started down the path to what's been going on. Again, that doesn't justify Russia invading, but it does provide some context to understand what's going on, and I think it's important for us. And yes, we should be worrying about our own country. We should, again, I am the one candidate who talks about bringing all the troops home, ending all the overseas spending. So we're going to stop paying for proxy wars. We're going to stop supporting other wars like the Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Again, we got a war powers resolution going through both houses of Congress, so I would encourage anybody listening or watching this, make sure you call 833-STOP-WAR. There's also the website 833-STOP-WAR. I think it's .com, but maybe it's .org. But just call that number. They'll connect you first to your congressional representative. You put in your zip code. They give you your representative in Congress, and then to your 2 senators. You tell them, hey, I want you to support that Yemen War Powers Resolution to cut off U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Now, that resolution, if it passes and it gets signed off by the president, may still not really get the job done. I want to make sure that that's clear. The wording, I think, still allows for some wiggle room, because what you call defensive and offensive, and we can still maybe be supporting the Saudis if fighting heats up again in Yemen. There's been a ceasefire going on for a little while now there, which is promising, and it does seem like the Saudis and the Emiratis don't want to continue fighting there, but they realize that there's no real upside for them. But they've been doing it for over 7 years, so. But we could withdraw U.S. support and really kind of force it to a close. But again, that's just one theater. But the point I'm trying to get at is, even where we pass these sort of legislation and whatnot to try to pull things back, even if we did, really the executive branch likes to work around these things and play these little games, and certainly the military likes to do certain things without quite the let's say quite the level of transparency or awareness that we think there should be. But my point is if we want to bring a stop to it, you don't need to be pulling through separate bills like this. It's real simple. Stop giving them the money. And this goes to a lot of sort of inappropriate behavior from the government. If we are upset about, say, the FBI, what it's been doing for a couple of decades, and it's been spreading out to other areas where they've been doing it as well, but, radicalizing impressionable people in one or another community, they particular focus on the Muslim community over the last 20 years, but radicalizing impressionable people, entrapping them in manufactured terrorist plots in order to bump up their counterterrorism numbers. That sort of stuff that I think most people don't think we should be paying for. Politicization of them as an agency as well is probably a pretty bad thing, and they've had a pretty bad track record from the very beginning. So, the fact that the Department of Justice does all the stuff that it does, we won't go after the everybody on the Epstein client list, even though Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to how many decades in prison, and obviously Epstein himself, his legal troubles before he committed suicide. So it's by funding that we can hold these agencies to hold their feet to the fire and try to force them to either do the right thing or to at least stop being able to do the wrong things. And that is at least one thing that Congress in its two houses can do to exercise some control here and prevent the worst abuses. Again, the fact that we're going after Julian Assange, and just this in general, this sort of dynamic we have where it's always the whistleblowers, and he's not even the whistleblower per se, he's just a guy who spreads the information. But, it's wild that, for folks like Snowden and Chelsea Manning and all these folks, it's the whistleblower who gets punished, and the people who actually did all the wrong stuff get no punishment. So it's only the whistleblowers who get arrested. It's the whistleblowers who get hung out to dry, put in prison, or they're forced to kind of flee and live in exile. But it never the folks who are actually involved in the terrible programs and all the lying and the violating the Constitution. Those aren't the ones who ever go to prison. The program maybe gets stopped, or at least it gets revealed. But that's a dynamic that needs to get flipped over. Okay, the whistleblowers should be the ones who are let free, and the people who are misusing and abusing government power are the ones who should be held accountable. But unfortunately, we have the opposite going on. So, United States, this is from Joseph Mills. United States and NATO countries laughing at diplomatic solutions December through February. Now Russia refuses, rightfully. It's. I've said this a few times in different conversations. I think at every turn we've kind of missed opportunities, and certainly if we had gone the diplomatic route back in February or March, what you could have negotiated as a settlement probably would have been a lot more favorable than what you can. We've allowed the situation to deteriorate, and the more that Russia takes certain territory and engages in the annexations and whatever, the more Russia will be able to, they'll have more leverage as time goes on. Russia will have more leverage in future negotiations because they've just taken more territory, and they've and there have been such heavy losses on the Ukrainian side. So it's the failure and the unwillingness to negotiate, to engage diplomatically that has just allowed things to continue to get worse, and it's indicative of the problem we have, and the unfitness to lead, the lack of fitness to lead, unsuitability of leadership in government. Again, Republicans and Democrats and their appointees in all areas of government, certainly on the diplomatic side. It has been a failure. We didn't need to get to this point. And again, and this is not something that just happened overnight with Biden as president, and that's something nobody should be under any illusion about. We didn't get this way overnight. I mean, we have been expanding NATO, getting closer and closer to Russia, for the last 30 years after the Soviet Union's fall, and without any real consideration for what even, and again, not even necessarily non-interventionist folks like myself, not folks who are like very much about peace and non-interventionism, even just sort of pragmatic folks who are like the diplomats who led us through the Cold War. Even the even somebody as awful as Henry Kissinger, or somebody like George Kennan, who spent so much time working in particular directly with the Soviet Union. All of them recognize that the policy path that we've gone on here has been extremely misguided, extremely dangerous, and it is, creating the conditions for increasing the likelihood of this kind of conflict arising, and just kind of pushing us towards this as we get closer and closer to Russia's border on all sides, and in particular this kind of area where Ukraine really being, I think, a red line, as they probably said, from the Russian perspective, that's really a red line in terms of NATO getting into Ukraine. So officially or unofficially, which, let's be honest, it's the NATO countries that are really involved here in terms of trying to provide all this aid and weapons and everything to Ukraine. So because the policy has been not to negotiate, but instead to send weapons and continue this rhetoric. I've made the point a few times in interviews and anywhere else I can that the only time the U.S. has really discussed, or at least would say between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov on the Russian side, the only time that they've what's the word I'm looking for? The only time that they have, the only time that they've spoken since the invasion began was about trying to get Brittany Griner released. Okay, they've made a deliberate effort to not try to discuss terms to de-escalate the situation. And I've heard a lot of people, when I bring this up, a lot of people bring up the fact that, well, it's not for the U.S. to negotiate. It's Ukraine. Ukraine's a sovereign country. The U.S. can't be negotiating territorial concessions, and I think that's a fair argument. But what role is the U.S. playing in all of this? The U.S. is not playing a neutral role. You may say, well, I want the U.S. to be neutral, but we shouldn't be doing that. Some people obviously are very much pro-U.S. intervention and helping in whatever way. You had crazy people earlier this year who were talking about putting a no-fly zone, which is basically straight ticket to World War III. But some people will argue against that the U.S. really shouldn't be negotiating for them. But one thing that the U.S. definitely can offer as a concession, because it's within the U.S.'s power, would be to say, no, we won't put Ukraine into NATO. And realistically, they probably were never going to put Ukraine into NATO anyway. I mean, I think most people believe, or the general consensus among folks observing with, NATO and the opinions of the NATO countries, is that most of them don't want to have Ukraine in NATO anyway. So you're not even really conceding anything by just saying, yes, Ukraine will never be a part of NATO. If in fact Ukraine was never going to be a part of NATO, to just say it and to give it as a guarantee is sacrificing nothing, and you're getting some kind of capital in terms of this negotiation. You're getting some kind of value out of it, because it's one of those things that they've been so adamant about in terms of what they want out of this. So to the comment about nuclear weapons, it's unfortunate that that is that gets thrown out here. And unfortunately, again, the more it escalates, the closer it gets to reality. It doesn't make any sense. there's no reason in the world. I mean, what are we going to go to nuclear war with Russia and obliterate the human species to over, who controls like Kherson and something? Again, no offense to the folks who live there or from there. But again, we need to have some measure of I don't know, the scale and what's at stake in terms of this kind of conflict. And again, it's not about capitulation. It's about being realistic about what the costs are and what are the things you're willing to sacrifice and what you're willing to fight over, and what's worth it, and what really, again, considering the cost. Again, the cost beyond the monetary cost, because we've already sent upwards of 50 or 60 billion to Ukraine in terms of aid and what's been allocated by Congress and everything so far this year. It's pretty close to the Russian defense budget, to be honest with you. Although, to be fair, they have other considerations besides just the official defense stuff. Their country's being laid to waste. But that's really the bigger cost, is the cost that the Ukrainian people are paying with lives, with their country being destroyed. None of that stuff is going to, well, the human lives are never going to come back, but the country itself being restored fully, that's going to take a long time as well, and it's going to take even longer the longer the fighting goes out. I had a back and forth with somebody, I'm trying to think, it was earlier this week, and we got into it, and at some point, because I brought up the fact that we're essentially trying to emulate the policy we had with the U.S. supporting when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, our support for not just the Afghans but also the foreign fighters who came in, the Mujahideen, which has a special relationship with 9/11 and Al Qaeda and all that, but that wasn't the reason why. Not the main reason for my objection, because when someone tries to present, and this is something I want to really always hammer home of any chance I get, some people present this idea as though supporting the war effort and refusing to negotiate any kind of concessions and doing all this, some people view that as, oh, you're standing up for it because you care about the Ukrainian people, and I think that's completely wrong. The policy that we have is that we are using Ukraine to bleed Russia, to hurt Russia, and the U.S. government, who is pushing this, could not care less about the Ukrainian people. I'm not even sure the Ukrainian government cares a great deal about the Ukrainian people in terms of what they're doing. The longer the war goes on, it's the more the Ukrainian people suffer. And the reason I point out the example with Afghanistan, and I was having this conversation, and the gentleman I was speaking to, he would refuse to kind of take a stand. I was like, well, because he responded when I brought it up, and I was like, well, are you sort of implying that this is a good model for us to follow, that we should try to emulate what happened what happened when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan? Should we be trying to emulate that in Ukraine today? And he wouldn't give me a straight answer. But obviously it seems to be what we're doing, and anyone who supports what we're doing, I think, has to be kind of supporting that. And here's the real problem with that. If you care about the Ukrainian people, I believe the estimates on terms of just civilian deaths in that conflict in Afghanistan back in the 1980s was upwards of 1 million to 2 million. Okay, civilians killed. Okay, so if you care about these people, you don't want this happening there. You don't want this happening anywhere. This is not what you do when you care about people. When you care about people, you're trying to save lives. That's the compassionate thing to do, to try to avoid these conflicts. It's not as glorious, and it's not wrought with all this. It doesn't make for all these dramatic pictures of these big victories and defeating the enemies and making a big statement and hurting the other guys. But it's just important for us to recognize the difference between what it is that our policies are doing and what actual compassion looks like. Because actual compassion is trying to save human lives and try to avoid this kind of destruction. Because at the end of the day, that matters a whole lot more than whether it's Ukrainian oligarchs or Russian oligarchs who own a particular town or province or whatever, ostensibly. So we've got to be, we've got to have a bit of resolve about that, and not allow the propaganda and the insistence of from all these folks in our mainstream media and our mainstream of politics to kind of convince us of otherwise, to kind of make us believe that this that the right thing to do is really to sacrifice these people's lives in order to achieve this greater good, perceivably, of, or at least the American interest of harming Russia and reducing Russia's power and strength and ability to project power within the region or anywhere else, to try to undercut them. And I don't know what the end game is there, but it definitely isn't trying to save Ukrainian lives. And I think if that's anyone's concern, then I think we need to definitely reevaluate the policy, because we're not doing that right now. We're at past 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up, guys. I plan to be on next week as well. So thank you guys again for joining me. We've only got a few more weeks. If you've got your ballots already, obviously vote for Dennis Misegoy. Also vote for Hector Ruz for governor, and him and Jerry Rorbaugh as governor and lieutenant governor. And but I should be your third name on the ballot all here across the state of Florida. So if you're not doing the mail-in voting, get ready for when you're doing early voting, if you decided to vote early or on election day. But thank you guys again for joining me, and I will talk to you guys next week, if not sooner. Take care.